My name is Jack. I'm 24, and I make a living crawling around in the darkness. You could call me a caver, but it's more than a job to me. It's an obsession. I lead tourists through winding tunnels and squeeze them into tight spaces they didn't think they could fit in. They pay me to teach them how to overcome their fears, but to be honest, I'm not any braver than anyone else. I've just learned to push fear to the corner and ignore it. Most of the time, I got into caving by accident. When I was a kid, my family went on vacation to a cavern. It was one of those prominent tourist attractions with paved paths and handrails. The kind of place that gets lit up with colored bulbs to make it look nice. I was 10 years old at the time, but I still wanted more. I remember asking the guide where the tunnels were, and he said, "Know where you want to go, kid?" That stuck with me. I decided I wanted to go wherever the tunnels led. A few years later, I persuaded my father to accompany me to a local caving club meeting. Those guys, grizzled older men with beards, callous hands, and stories about being trapped for hours in passages no wider than your shoulders, were my heroes. By the time I was 18, I was spending every weekend underground. I'd crawl into places so tight you couldn't even lift your head. I'd come home with bruises on my ribs and mud in places mud should never be, and I'd call it a good time. My mom thought I was crazy. My dad just said, better than sitting in front of a screen all day. Now, caving is my life. I work for a firm that provides tours of a vast cave system. I know every twist and curve like the back of my hand. I've remembered the names of every stalactite and every flowstone formation. On weekends, though, I go renegade. No guided tours. No safety rails. Just me, my helmet, and my headlamp hunting for the areas no one else has been brave or dumb enough to go. There's something about the unknown that pulls me in. A dark, unexplored tunnel is like a riddle waiting to be solved. I'll crawl through 100 feet of muck to see what's on the other side. Sometimes, it's nothing but more rock. But occasionally, there's a cavern so gorgeous it takes your breath away. That's the high I'm always pursuing. This weekend, I decided to check out a new place. I'd heard whispers of a cave buried in the woods about an hour's drive from town. It was not on any maps, and no one seemed to know much about it. That was all the invitation I needed. I packed my gear, helmet, ropes, flashlight, extra batteries, and snacks, and left early Saturday morning. The trailhead was not signposted, but I discovered a hazy explanation of how to get there in an old forum post. Follow the creek until you see a rock shaped like a bear's head, he continued. The entrance is just past that. The hike began peacefully. The woods were silent except for the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional chirp of a bird. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. I located the bear-shaped rock exactly where the ad claimed it would be. It did like a bear in a skewed fashion, with moss growing over its ears. Just beyond it, I noticed a door. It was a jagged hole on the side of a limestone bluff, half hidden by ferns. The aperture was just broad enough to crawl through. Perfect. I took out my flashlight and flashed it into the dark. The beam vanished into a black hole. My pulse accelerated. This was it, an unexplored cave. Perhaps no one had ever stepped inside. I slid into the opening on my stomach and wriggled forward like a snake. The rock scraped against my jacket, but I wasn't bothered. This was the part one loved. The sense of being swallowed by the soil, of leaving the world behind. As the light from the entryway faded, I felt the usual combination of thrill and fear. What lay ahead? I had no idea. The first room wasn't much to look at. A room with low ceilings, rough walls, and loose rocks on the floor. I squatted down and surveyed the area with my flashlight. 2 tunnels were heading outside. One was thin and inclined up. The other was broad enough to walk through, but it descended sharply into the depths. I picked the steeper option. As I dropped, the air became colder and thicker. My breath resonated across the cramped room. The walls appeared to press in on me, forcing me to duck to avoid scratching my helmet. I continued going, deeper and deeper. That's when I spotted the first hint that something wasn't right. It was a wooden box, just lying there on the cave floor, like someone had left it behind. At first, I thought it was an old toolbox or maybe part of some abandoned mining equipment. But when I crouched down to take a closer look, my flashlight caught the sharp edges of nails hammered into its corners. It wasn't a box, but a coffin. I froze. My brain struggled for a plausible answer. This had to be a prank. Some weird, macabre joke left by other cavers to freak out whoever wandered in here. I laughed nervously, but the sound felt out of place in the stillness. My laughter faded, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the cave. I remained there for what seemed like an eternity, trying to determine what to do. Eventually, curiosity won out. I moved closer and swept my beam over the area. That's when I noticed them. 3 additional coffins are placed in a tidy little row. They're all identical, given the wet, muddy setting. Everything appears astonishingly clean. They were equally spaced apart, as if someone had precisely calculated the distance between them. What the hell? I whispered to myself, the sound of my voice making me feel slightly less alone. My chest clenched, and a chilly knot of discomfort developed in my gut. This couldn't be genuine. Who would drag coffins down here? And why? My boots crunched on the gravelly floor as I approached the first one. It was just a basic wooden box, unadorned. The wood seemed aged but not rotting, which didn't make sense. Any organic matter in this damp environment should have decayed long ago. My hand hovered over the lid, unsure. Every rational part of me screamed, "Leave it alone, turn around and get the hell out of there." But the tug of curiosity was too powerful. I slowly gripped the edge and lifted. The lid creaked open, and the fragrance reached me first. A mild, musty odor reminiscent of old books and wet ground. My flashlight beam shook as I pointed it inside. A kid, a young boy, around 6 or 7 years old. His complexion was pale, and his hair was dusty blonde. He was dressed in what appeared to be old-fashioned clothes, a button-up shirt and suspenders similar to those seen in black and white photographs. His hands were neatly crossed over his chest, holding a little wooden toy. I slammed the lid shut and fell backwards, my heart thumping so fiercely it seemed like it was about to burst. This was not occurring. It could not be happening. Maybe it was a dummy, an elaborate prop designed to scare explorers. Yeah, that had to be it. I just wanted to prove it to myself. I pushed myself to continue to the next casket, the disquiet in my stomach now tearing at my insides. The second one was slightly bigger. My hands shook as I raised the lid. Inside was a young girl, no older than 10. She wore a lacy white dress suitable for a wedding or funeral. Her dark hair was neatly braided over one shoulder, and her hands held a small porcelain doll. Her eyes were closed, and her face looked as serene as if she were asleep. But there was no rise and fall of her chest, no warmth on her flesh. I backed backwards, my torch flickering as if reacting to the mounting terror inside me. My intellect shouted for me to go, to flee this horror and run back to the surface. But something rooted me there. Perhaps it was a desire to understand, or maybe I was too afraid to move. The third coffin was even more significant. This one had to carry an adult. I hesitated and swallowed hard. Every part of me wanted to stop, but I leaned forward and lifted the lid. Inside was a man in his mid-30s or 40s with sharp features and high cheekbones. He wore a dark suit that was slightly frayed around the edges. His hands were clutched over his tummy, and his skin was as pale as the children's. The fourth casket was identical in size, and I knew what I was going to see before I opened it. Sure enough, A woman, perhaps in her 40s, lay within. She was beautiful, with long dark hair and a serene expression. She wore a simple dress, the fabric worn but clean. Her hands held a small bouquet of dried flowers. A family, 2 parents and 2 children, lying in this dark, forgotten cave as if they belonged. I staggered back and flattened against the wall, breathing in short, frantic breaths. My flashlight shook in my grasp, throwing unsteady shadows across the walls. I didn't know what to think or what to believe. Who were they? How long had they been here? And why? As I crouched down, trying to steady my breathing, something caught my eye. Above the coffins, carved into the rock wall, was a message etched in jagged, uneven letters. "We wait for the light." The words sent a chill down my spine. They didn't make sense, but something about them felt final. I stood there for a long time, staring at the coffins, the message, the family trapped in time. A million questions ran through my thoughts, but I had no answers. Then the air changed. It wasn't precisely a sound, but more of a vibration. I turned back to face the coffins. The lids were movable. At first, it was subtle, a faint creak of wood that could easily be mistaken for the cave's groaning. But then, one by one, the lids slid open as if something inside was pushing them away. My legs stuck in place, and my breath caught in my throat. The man instantly sat up, frightening me so much that I nearly lost my torch. His pale face shifted toward the woman, who rose in a calmer, more methodical manner. The youngsters followed their little, weak shapes unfolding like marionettes. None of them spoke, but their heads swiveled in unison, their hollow, unblinking gazes surveying the cavern. I hid behind a collection of rocks, scarcely daring to breathe. My flashlight was still turned on, and its faint glow threatened to give me away. I fumbled to turn it off, falling into suffocating darkness. My heart pounded in my ears as I pressed my back against the cold, damp stone, attempting to shrink myself as small as possible. "Do you smell something?" A smooth and cold voice, like the cave walls, broke the silence. It was a man. His voice echoed strangely, as if it didn't quite fit in this world. "Yes," the woman said. Her tone was gentler, almost sing-song, yet it had a bite that made my skin crawl. Something warm, fresh, a pause. "A man," one of the youngsters stated. "He's close." I clenched my teeth to avoid gasping. My hand moved to my lips, covering it to muffle the sound of my frantic gasps. The sound of shifting motions filled the cavern as the family crawled out of their coffins. Their footfall was methodical, yet oddly faint, like they barely brushed the earth. I dared to look out from behind the rock for just a second. The faint glimmer of their pale skin was the only thing visible in the darkness, like ghosts gliding over the cavern floor. "He must be near the entrance," the guy replied, his voice straining with a weird desire. "We should block it. He'll come to us when there is no other option." An icy fear sank into my chest. Block the entrance? My escape route? My heart fell. They were isolating me from the world above, keeping me in the darkness. For a long time, I did not move. I could not. My mind raced as I tried to process what I had just seen and heard. People don't wake up from coffins. They don't sit up like that and don't smell the prey. And yet, here I was. I gritted my teeth and turned back on my flashlight, angling the beam low to conceal my location. The light wavered, but it was steady enough to direct me along. I slipped into one of the narrower tunnels that led away from the main room, each step feeling like I was falling further into a nightmare. The tunnel was narrow, requiring me to stoop and occasionally crawl on all fours. The rock crushed in around me, and the air became heavier with each passing instant. Every sound was amplified. The scrape of my boots, the rasp of my breath, and the faint drop of water in the distance. I tried not to think about the family, their pale features, and eerie voices, but their words resounded in my head. "Do you smell food?" I shivered, my stomach tightening in knots. I did not dare to glance back. The thought of one of them creeping after me, glowing faces emerging from the darkness, was too much to bear. The tunnel twisted and turned, occasionally widening into small chambers and sometimes narrowing to the point where I had to squeeze through on my stomach. I lost all sense of direction. Now and again, I thought I heard faint voices behind me, borne by the winding corridors. "He can't go far. He'll tire soon." I shook my head, trying to block them out. They couldn't tell where I was. It was only my mind playing tricks on me. That's what I told myself anyway. After what seemed like hours, I stumbled into a larger chamber. The air was thicker here, almost suffocating, and the smell of damp earth was overshadowed by something else. Blood. My flashlight lighted the area, presenting a terrible scene. Bones. They were piled up and thrown across the floor like rubbish. Some were ancient, yellowed, and brittle, while others appeared strangely fresh, with pieces of flesh still adhering to them. My stomach churned, and I gagged, clamping a palm over my lips to prevent retching. This was their den and eating site. I wasn't the first person they trapped down here, nor would I be the last. A tiny sound made me freeze. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, coming from the tunnel I just crawled through. I extinguished my flashlight and leaned myself against the wall, blending into the darkness as best I could. My heart thundered in my chest so loud I was sure they'd hear it. The footfall got closer, accompanied by the faint sound of breathing, a low, scratchy intake, followed by an exhale that almost sounded like a sigh. Close, the man's voice muttered, so soft it was practically a whisper. "He's close." I did not move. I didn't breathe. I pressed my back against the cold rock, willing myself to vanish into the darkness. The footsteps paused. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a quiet laugh. "You can't hide forever," the woman explained. The sound of their footsteps diminished as they proceeded further into the tunnel's deceit. I remained where I was, too scared to leave. My mind raced, anxious for a solution. But all I could think about was the mounting confidence that I wouldn't make it out of here alive. The footsteps receded, but I did not dare move. My back was crushed against the jagged wall, and I could feel the uneven rock cutting into my spine. My breaths were short, calculated, and quiet. The type you take when you know any sound may reveal your identity. I thought I heard faint murmurs in the distance, as if the family was talking to one another, but their words were difficult to understand. I had to keep going. Sitting here would merely postpone the inevitable, and I didn't like my odds if they came back this way. Turning on my lights as low as possible, I surveyed the room. The bones scattered over the floor shone dully in the weak light, each one a whispered warning. Go if you can. I pressed ahead, crawling into the next corridor, which was smaller and steeper than the last. The walls felt to push against me more closely now, like the cave itself was conspiring to capture me. My hands slid on the moist rock, and my legs hurt as I climbed further into the soil, away from anything that seemed slightly safe. Every muscle in my body shouted for me to turn around and go back, but I couldn't, not with them someplace behind me. Their pale features and lifeless, unblinking eyes seared into my memory. As I crawled, I started hearing sounds again. Faint noises, a gentle laugh, and the scratch of movement echoing through the tube. They were close. Too close. Come back, the man said. You'll only make this harder. I gritted my teeth and continued moving. My palms stung from scraping against the sharp edges, but I didn't mind. The pain was preferable to stopping. Better than getting caught. Another voice, this one from a lady, Approach me. You're simply exhausting yourself. It won't help. The air around me felt colder as I went deeper. The passage opened into another chamber, but instead of relief, I felt dread. Because the chamber was not empty. They were present. The family, all four of them, standing completely motionless. Their pale faces faced toward the tunnel I had just crawled out of. My breath seized in my throat as I raced backwards, but it was too late. Their heads snapped in unison, their unblinking eyes locking onto mine. "There you are," the man said, his lips curling into a slow smile. I didn't think. I just ran. The tunnel was tighter now, my shoulders scraping against the walls as I stumbled forward. The air smelt terrible, like decay, and every breath burned in my chest. Behind me, I could hear them move. They were not running. We were not chasing. They were walking. Their footsteps were deliberate and slow, as if they knew I had nowhere to go. "You're going the wrong way," the young kid remarked, his voice echoing weirdly along the corridor. "There's nothing for you down there." I ignored him, pressing forward even as the passage grew steeper and more jagged. My flashlight flickered again, and I smacked it against my palm, muttering a desperate curse. The beam remained steady, but I knew it wouldn't last much longer. The sound of their footsteps became louder and closer. "We don't have to do this," the woman said, her voice honeyed and harsh. "Come back, and we'll make it quick." I couldn't stop looking back. Just a glimpse. They were there, huddled low in the tunnel, their pale features lit slightly by my failing lamp. The youngsters grinned, their teeth unervingly bright, and the dad cocked his head, observing me and smiling. I scrambled forward, my hands and knees slamming against the rock. I wasn't even thinking anymore, just moving, desperate to get away. The tunnel curved sharply, and then, impossibly, there it was. Light. A faint, circular beam of sunlight spilt through a crack in the ceiling, cutting through the oppressive darkness like a lifeline. My heart surged. I didn't think about how it made no sense for sunlight to be down here. I didn't care. It was light, and I was going to reach it. I limped inside the chamber, the sunshine warming my face for the first time since I'd entered this nightmare. My legs trembled as I stood erect, my back straightening for the first time in hours. The circle of light was modest, no more than a few feet across, yet it seemed like walking into another universe. The footsteps paused. I turned slowly, my breath hitching as I saw them emerge from the darkness one by one. The man, the lady, the children. They surrounded the beam of sunlight, standing just beyond its reach. Their features were expressionless now, but their eyes sparkled with something cold and calculating. "You think this will save you?" the guy asked, his voice calm and steady. I didn't answer. The woman grinned, bending her head as she watched me. "It's clever, but wisdom won't keep the sun from setting." The tiny child giggled. "It's a fun game. We can wait," she replied. They did not move closer. They stood there, and his smile widened. "The sun won't last much longer." I looked up, tracing the beam of light back to its source. It was already fading, with the borders of the circle becoming dimmer as the minutes passed. I wasn't sure what to do. I collapsed to my knees in the midst of the light, my body shivering. The laughing began, sweet and harsh, reverberating off the walls of the cavern. It came from all of them, their voices merging into a sad symphony. I closed my eyes, my breathing raspy. There was no escaping. There's no way out. The sun would be setting. The sunshine was fading minute by minute, and I could feel time slipping away with it. The circle of light that had served as my protection was now barely large enough for me to sit inside. I clutched my knees, my torch still at my side, and looked at the family. They were patient, too patient. The figure stood just beyond the fading light, his pallid features contorted into a pleased smile. His wife stood alongside him, her head angled slightly, scrutinizing me as if I were an unusual species in a cage. The youngsters stood silently by their parents, their black eyes fixated on me. The tiny child would sometimes chuckle gently, the sound like claws sliding down my spine. The circle of safety was diminishing inch by inch, and as it did, the family moved closer. The youngster was the first to move. His little, pale foot moved into the shade, just beyond the light's border. Then another step, followed by another. He paused just short of the diminishing circle, smirking at me with impossibly bright teeth. "You smell scared," he said. "It's good. Fear makes it sweeter." "Enough, darling," the woman whispered, her voice as silky as silk. She put her hand on the boy's shoulder and smiled down at him. Let him have his last moments in peace. They were waiting for the light to go, for me to be consumed by the darkness in which they lived. I clenched my teeth, my thoughts whirling. I could not let this be the end. There must be something I could do. The circle of light shrank again. The lady moved closer, her bare feet gliding silently across the stone floor. She was only a few feet away now, and her smile was sharper. I wanted to shout, lash out, or do anything other than sit there and wait for the inevitable. My hands groped at my chest, grasping my jacket as if it might somehow protect me. That was when I felt it, the crucifix. I always wore a little silver cross on a chain around my neck. I had forgotten it was there, hidden behind layers of cloth. My fingers instinctively wrapped around it, and I hesitated. Did I really think it would do anything? It was only a sign made of metal, but I had no better ideas. I removed the crucifix, the chain glinting slightly in the waning sunshine. The movement instantly drew their attention. The man's eyes narrowed, and his smile left his face. My fingers trembled as I held the cross in front of me, its silver reflecting the final rays of sunshine. The woman's demeanor clouded, and she took a cautious step backwards. "Put that down," she said, her voice no longer gentle. I did not. I stood slowly, the decreasing circle of light just wide enough to keep me upright. The youngsters snarled, their visage twisting into something non-human. I went forward, holding the cross as a shield. The reaction was quick. The man recoiled, his face distorted with rage and terror. "That won't save you," he snarled, but his voice trailed off. When I made another step, they all backed away, screaming and growling like caged animals. The light was nearly gone now, leaving just a faint glow around my feet, yet the cross appeared to have its strength. They wouldn't get closer. "Stay back," I said, my voice shaking but steady. The guy pushed forward, but as soon as the cross caught the slightest gleam of light, he staggered back with a guttural howl. His skin sizzled where the silver had grabbed him, and a little puff of smoke rose from his fingers. I didn't wait for them to regroup. I moved toward the tunnel, clutching the cross as if it were my last lifeline. The family surrounded me, remaining just out of reach, their eyes filled with rage. The youngsters hissed and snapped their teeth, and the woman's face contorted into a furious expression. My attention was on the tunnel ahead, putting as much distance as possible between myself and them. Every step seemed like a war, and my body trembled from terror and tiredness. The cross appeared to burn in my hand, but I gripped on harder, reluctant to let go. The family followed me, their motions strangely smooth. The tunnel widened as I progressed, and the air became colder and fresher. My pulse jumped as I noticed a tiny glimmer ahead. The door, the way out. They also saw it. The lady moved forward, but the cross pushed her back, her flesh scorching where the light struck her near what appeared to be a rose tattoo on her right arm. The children shouted out, their voices loud and unnatural, and the man's face contorted into a scowl of sheer hatred. I staggered toward the entryway, the cold evening air soothing me. The sun was almost gone, and the horizon was painted with the final streaks of orange and purple. I did not stop moving. I could not. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the family came to a stop. They stood just inside the cave, their pale faces framed by shadows, and the last rays of sunlight glinted off their unblinking eyes. For a moment, neither of them moved. The young boy tilted his head, his hair falling into his face. "Mom," he said quietly, almost whining, "I'm sad." He could have been a member of the family. The man stood in the center, his expression unreadable. I did not wait for anything else. My legs carried me to my car. My hands shook as I pressed the key into the ignition, and the engine roared to life. I drove faster than ever before, my headlights cutting through the thickening darkness. I didn't pause to glance back. When I returned to town, I could not remain silent. I hurried immediately to the local police station, stumbling into the lobby. My comments about the family in the cave came out in a frenzied rush. The officer at the desk looked at me like I had a second head. "A pale family in a cave," he said, sitting back in his chair. "And they hissed at your crucifix." I nodded, breathless, trying to emphasize how serious this was. "They blocked the entrance. They are dangerous. People need to keep away from the location. I promise I'm not insane." The cop shared a look with his companion. "We'll look into it," he answered, but his tone was dismissive. It was evident he didn't believe me. Next, I tried the locals. At the cafe, at the gas station, any place anyone would listen. Most humored me with polite nods or hesitant chuckles, but I could see it in their eyes. They thought I was simply some outsider with a weird imagination. Finally, desperate, I went to the church. The priest was ancient, maybe in his 70s, with a kind but suspicious expression. I told him everything, every detail of the family, the coffins, the diminishing sunshine, and the cross. He listened intently, nodding sometimes, but his face didn't alter. When I finished, he sighed and fell back in his chair. "Son," he replied, his voice quiet and measured, "people frequently see things they don't comprehend at times of extreme dread. I'm sure your experience seemed real to you, but—" "It was real," I said, banging my fist against the desk. "They're still out there, waiting for someone else to wander into that cave." He examined me for a long time, before leaning forward and putting his elbows on the desk. "I'll pray for you," he said. His tone was friendly, but I could see he didn't trust anything I said. I stood there disheartened, then turned to go. The priest's voice interrupted me as I was about to walk through the door. "That tattoo," he said, his tone becoming sharper. "The one you mentioned is on the young woman's arm. What did you say it was?" I turned back, perplexed. "It was a rose," I explained. "Just a simple black rose." The priest's face had lost its color. He reclined deeply in his chair, his fingers grabbing the armrest. "A rose," he said softly, more to himself than to me. His lips moved only slightly as he whispered, "It could be a coincidence. It must be a coincidence." I scowled and moved closer. "What does that mean? Do you know anything about them?" But he did not respond. His gaze seemed far away, focusing on someplace far outside the room we were in. I waited, but when it became evident that he was not going to say anything more, I left. I could not stay in that town. I couldn't even remain in the state. The cave, the family, the priest's reaction, it was all too much. Within a week, I packed up everything I owned and moved halfway across the country. Somewhere new, somewhere far away from any caverns or dark, twisting passages. I attempted to go on, but the memories persisted. I couldn't erase the sight of their pallid faces, their voices reverberating in my memory. I always kept a cross near, tucked under my shirt, as if it was the only thing keeping me safe. A few weeks later, I learned the news. It was a little story hidden in the local section of an online newspaper. A set of caverns near where I had left had unexpectedly collapsed. No one was wounded, and there were no reports of anyone being inside, although the caverns were entirely shut. The paper described it as a strange geological occurrence or cave-in, nothing more. But I knew better. The timing and place were too coincidental. I couldn't prove it, but I knew the priest had something to do with it. Maybe he went back into the cave after I left. Perhaps he'd seen something that made him believe I was telling the truth. Maybe he did something drastic to ensure that no one else ever met that family. I will never know for sure. The priest left no notes, and his name was not mentioned in the article. But I couldn't stop thinking about his pale face when I told him about the rose tattoo. I'm delighted he did it, regardless of what he knew or had seen. Maybe they were crushed by the rocks. Perhaps they died. But I do not think so. All I can hope is that they are imprisoned in that location, starving, and they never come out.